it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for joining via Zoom today. And I was super excited to talk with Carol and Chantico about this conversation because for me, as a person in social work and working in the nonprofit sector, I don't always have opportunities to talk about the sort of faith-based orientations to my work, and this is a nice opportunity to do that. And so I'm excited to talk about those conversations with you in a talk I'm calling Generosity Through Accompaniment, God's Invitation to Relationship. And so I'll talk for about a little while here, maybe I think about 20 minutes or so, or maybe a little longer, and then open it up for questions. But if you have a burning question that comes up during our conversation today, you can always try and add it in the chat, and I'll try and make sure that I see that, or Carol, you can remind me. So, sorry, now it's like zooming ahead of me here. There we go. So we have a question of what does it mean to be generous, which you've been exploring this past month. And I got to look a little bit at some of the materials you've been exploring over the past 3 weeks, which was really helpful to me to see where you're coming from and the types of conversations you've already been having. So I'm hoping that this will be a complement to, and not be sort of reiterating what you've heard, but provide something new as well into that conversation. And I wanted to start, and forgive me, I'm a person who anticipates seasons. And so I'm always the first person to turn on Christmas music in my house, and I often get in trouble for that. So I realize I'm drawing from something that's a little out of season here with the Christmas Carol, but I wanted to talk about the example of Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol when talking about generosity as perhaps a good lens to begin our conversation. And this is towards the end, a lovely quotation where he says, he's dressed himself all in his best and at last to go out into the streets. The people were that by this time pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present and walking with his hands behind him. Scrooge regarded every one of them with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. And I love this. You've probably seen different characterizations of it. I have 3 young children, and so I'm really into the Muppets version of the Christmas Carol story, which continues to bring me delight. And I think that we often focus on the end of he buys a turkey in the window and gives it to Bob Cratchit and his family, or he spends some time hanging out with his nephew. But I think at the end of the story, we often focus on the things he's giving away. But rather, sometimes it's important to look at just his disposition. His first things he does as he wakes up is he opens the window to his house, which he had never left during the story up until that point. And he walks out into the street with this iridescent joy. And I think that a thing that I take away from that is that Ebenezer Scrooge leaves his home and his office, and he goes out into the world to rebuild lost relationships. And so while we often think of generosity maybe in financial terms, or in something that we are giving away, I think that what is interesting in this story is the centrality of relationship in Ebenezer Scrooge's use of generosity, that he's using this as an opportunity to restore some of the lost relationships that he had prior in the Christmas Carol story. So that's what I'll focus on today, is to think about being generous as bringing about the common good by focusing on relationships. And so I'll talk a little bit about that kind of up front, and then also share some examples of what that might look like on a broader scale. So I know that you've had a chance to reflect on the gospel passage of the Good Samaritan, and this is a lovely image of by John August Swanson. And my wife and I have come to really enjoy this artist, who's artist all over Candler School of Theology, where my wife teaches, and we have a few pieces in our home now too. But ultimately with the Good Samaritan, there's lots of things we can focus on. It's a story about thinking about how we redefine the question, who is our neighbor, certainly, and very intentionally the use of a Samaritan in the story to be the person who ultimately helps the person on the road. And I wanted to share with you another piece that has come out this past October, Pope Francis. I should have also forewarned that I'm Catholic at the front of this too, so I'm going to draw from a lot of Catholic stuff in this talk. But Pope Francis recently wrote an encyclical called Fratelli Tutti on brotherly or fraternal love. And he focuses a whole section on the Good Samaritan, which I thought was relevant for our conversation today. And he, in reflecting on the Good Samaritan, says, only one person stops, approached this man and cared for him personally, even spending his own money to provide for his needs. He also gave him something that in our frenetic world we cling to so tightly. He gave him his time. Certainly, he had his own plans for that day, his own needs, commitments, and desires, yet he was able to put that aside when confronted with someone in need. Without even knowing the injured man, he saw him as deserving of his time and attention. And I think that's something that I think I've often kind of forgot in the story of the Good Samaritan, is that when we think of generosity and when we think of kind of working to care for others, that the attention and time that is sometimes the most valuable thing that we have is sometimes the most valuable thing to give. So to be generous then is to give of your time, of your attention, your whole and very being. You might even think of the different ways in the Gospels in which this shows up. Perhaps the poor widow who gives just 1 or 2 coins, in generosity, but Jesus points to that and says she's giving everything she has. That's more than those who give many more coins, but who are not giving of their fullest selves. And so how we think about generosity is giving our full selves and entering into that whole spirit with no strings attached, right? So then ultimately, then we also have this question of, okay, well, what does this look like now? Not just in the Gospels or in, Charles Dickens, but what does this look like in your lives in Charlotte now? And so that's what we want to do today, which is to explore how you might approach the world in a spirit of generosity to accompany the poor in a journey towards wholeness. And at this point, and I'll probably spend a little time, I kind of joke, my wife is a theologian and I'm a social worker. So we kind of like go back and forth between those two worlds a lot. And so at this point, I'll probably move more into the social work world, which is a bit more my area of expertise in any case. But I'm going to start here too. And I know this has been a number of quotes, but this is something that's good, by a gentleman by the name of Paul Farmer. Some of you may be familiar with Paul Farmer's work. There was a book written about him called Mountains Beyond Mountains, which is a fantastic read if you haven't had a chance to check it out. Paul Farmer is a Harvard professor and physician, and he also started the organization Partners in Health, which has done all kinds of amazing global health work around the world. And he's seen as a real kind of leader in thinking about global health, global poverty issues. And he was giving a graduation speech to the Kennedy School at Harvard around policymaking. And he was writing about this term called accompaniment, which I have come to make a huge part of my work in social work and in nonprofit practice. And so he says, to accompany someone is to go somewhere with him or her, to break bread together, and to be present on a journey with a beginning and an end. There's an element of mystery, of openness, and of trust in accompaniment. The companion, the accompagnator, says, I'll go with you and support you on your journey wherever it leads. I'll share your fate for a while. And by a while, I don't mean a little while. Accompaniment is about sticking with the task until it's deemed completed, not by the accompagnateur, but by the person being accompanied. So it's important to think too a little bit about the context in which he's giving this quotation. Paul Farmer is speaking to Harvard graduates, and he's trying to position accompaniment as something that is different from our traditional understanding of charity or aid in the global settings, in the sense that you might think of charity or aid as something that's a one-time gift, a disaster relief that's often given through international NGOs, and sometimes happens to people rather than with people. And Paul Farmer brings this sort of understanding of accompaniment to help us reframe and rethink the ways in which we're thinking about charity and an aid, to think about and put at that central point, again, relationships at the core of that work, breaking bread together, going on a journey, taking it wherever it leads, sharing one's fate, and sticking with a task until it's deemed completed. All of these things, of course, we can also see elements coming out in the Good Samaritan story. So if we think about accompaniment and relationship in this work, I'd like to propose that we think about this through 4 different stages, through engagement, assessing, intervening, and evaluating. And I'm going to share some examples in 3 of these of work I've done in Charlotte to talk a little bit about what this might look like for you as you're thinking about this work. So first, to accompany me is to engage. And I have a screenshot here from a film called The Mission, which some of you may be familiar with, which is a story about transformation in the context of colonial America. And you can see Robert De Niro's character here, Rodrigo Mendoza, we open the movie where he is engaged in the slave trade, and he is trying to capture indigenous peoples and enslave them and sell them. And that is his role in this colonial world that he's living in. And he goes through this transformation process where he recognizes the evil of his work, and ultimately has a complete about face throughout the course of the film. And there's this beautiful scene where right here, you can see he ties up all of his armor, his swords, all of the trappings of his slave trader life. He ties them to his body, and he climbs through this river and then ultimately up this waterfall to go and to be present and to live with the Guarani people, who were the people whom he was formerly in charge of enslaving. And it's this beautiful and moving scene, rich and full of all kinds of imagery around water and baptism and sin, as he's sort of overcoming this. But I think what's important for our conversation today, as you think about this scene, if you've seen the movie, or just drawing from what I've told you, is that Robert De Niro's character recognizes that there are barriers that have been put between colonizer and colonized in this moment, and that he had been participating in that, and that has been all part of his life. And to have a true transformation, he couldn't just stop being a slave trader. He couldn't just continue on his life as it was before, but it needed a full and radical transformation that required that he might live and break bread with the very people he used to persecute and to enslave. And so it's a beautiful section of this film where he does it. Now, there are a little bit of problems with this film, just because, you don't really hear a lot about whether or not the indigenous Guarani people wanted him to come and live with him or not. But that's a conversation really for another day. But ultimately, I think that when you begin a conversation around accompaniment, about relationship, specifically when you're positioning, if you're coming from a position as I am, as a position who is a person of white privilege, how do I engage in the world? That fundamentally, we have to begin with true and authentic encounter and in relationship. And so when we think about engagement centered in authentic human relationships, we can't do these things from, I know it's going to sound ironic as I say this, behind a computer screen, right? But that it involves really going out and building those relationships, and oftentimes crossing those barriers that divide communities by race, by class, or by gender, and by zip code. And you know how all these things are divided in Charlotte, as I do, along those lines, and that it requires us to move beyond those factors, to know about them, understand them, and move beyond them. It's not transactional. It's not about I do something for somebody and then they do something back for me, but rather it's about building a shared sense of understanding. Engagement is also long-term. It's not about doing a one-time service project. It's not about doing a one-time moment or experience, but rather saying, I'm here and committed to this work, which is going to take time, because it requires engagement and relationship building, which takes time. It's about building relationships and friendships that go beyond the work at hand. It's about eating, going together and sharing a meal. It's about attending funerals and baptisms, maybe in a church that's not your own. It means going and celebrating in festivals. It means being with people in times of difficulty, like evictions or COVID crises. And so that these relationships are not simply centered on whatever task is at hand, say addressing affordable housing, but rather that those relationships extend beyond that, so that the work is not seen as, so that the relationship goes beyond just that. And also so important at the very end of this here, requiring a sense of empathy and interpersonal skills. And this is where, empathy, I think, is such an important thing to begin. Actually, I'll tell a silly story here. My oldest daughter is going to kindergarten, and they wanted to model how to teach empathy to kindergartners. And they're doing this over Zoom, which was really amazing to watch the kindergarten teachers do this. And so they would say, okay, first what we're going to do when you talk about being empathetic is first to restate how the other person's feeling. So somebody came to say how they felt about COVID-19, and someone might say, oh, I feel sad because I can't see my friends. And so the teacher would say, like, okay, hey, Nora, to my daughter, can you talk to Tensu and say, I understand that it must be hard for you not to be able to see your friends during COVID-19. And then I understand that it might be hard that, and I also would understand that too, if that happened to me, or if I can't also see my friends. So I also feel kind of sad, and I'm sorry that it feels that way. And it was beautiful because it's in kindergarten teaching these really incredible social skills that we often lack sometimes as adults as well. But at the start of that exchange, the focus of it was to really understand the perspective and feelings and thoughts of the person to whom one is being empathetic to. And I think that's a really important lesson that I'll always remember for the rest of my life, and how that was taught to Nora, and how we also have to bring that empathetic perspective in this work. So after we have this relationship building, after that true, authentic engagement, encounter, and relationship building occurs through accompaniment, it's also important then to really understand the problem at hand. So this is, I'm thinking of also trying to push this a little bit, not that you haven't necessarily thought this way before, but when we think about the term generosity, you might, again, even recalling Scrooge, where he's like, I'm going to buy a turkey in the window and send it down the street, right? It's kind of a one-time thing. But if we think about addressing social problems in Charlotte, if we think about really engaging in community dialogue over a long period of time, it's important to also begin, after those relationships have started, with a true and authentic assessment of what the problem is that we're facing. So what is it that we're actually what is it that we want to tackle as a church community? What is it that the communities with whom we are going to be working, if they are not within our church community, how do they also see these problems, and how do we come together to identify that problem and bring clarity to that problem before beginning any work? So you're deriving qualitative and quantitative data. This is a picture from the Quality of Life Explorer, which you may have checked out online. It's a great resource where you can look at things like health and economic and education data stratified by zip code across the city, or neighborhood profile areas. And here we see a very common wedge that's often talked about in Charlotte with respect to income disparity across the city. But you can check that out and see all different kinds of things as well. But I think a key part of this too is that you bring in data, you bring in experts, but that it also requires diverse voices and sources at the table when defining what that problem looks like. If you define this problem and the only people sitting at the table are people at your church, then you're doing it wrong. And so it's important to bring in people from the communities in which you intend to be working and serving, to ensure that they have a share in defining what that problem is and saying, these are the needs of our community. These are the challenges that we are experiencing. And so it's a collective process, which again is only possible if that trust has already been built through authentic engagement beforehand. Then you can talk about intervention. So I have a flyer here that talks about one program that I was doing while I was at UNC Charlotte called Padres Unidos. And it was at Hidden Valley Elementary, up not too far from University City. And the purpose of this program was for us to have conversations about parenting and helping to support the social and emotional development of children. And what was fun about this project, and what I was really excited about, is that we were conducting it entirely in Spanish. Many of the parents at Hidden Valley are Spanish speakers only. And I was working with the Communities and Schools coordinator there, Missy, affectionately called Marianela Echeverria, and she and I put together this program together on parenting together. And so the focus of the group was to come in on the school grounds, in the school library, bringing young children and whoever with you that you needed to bring with you to account for their childcare needs, to get together over some coffee and donuts and to talk about different topics in supporting the social and emotional development of children. Now, I came to this as a researcher in having some academic literature in social and emotional learning, but at this time, I didn't have my 3 children as old as they are now, and I was still learning as a parent. And so while I brought this academic expertise to the conversation and set things up and had topics and agendas for us to talk about today, the real work of this was a communal process of parents sharing with each other what they do when their child doesn't want to do homework, what they do when their child is struggling to identify how they feel, what do they do when their partner or their father in the family isn't able to express their emotions, and so their son also is struggling to figure out what a model looks like for a male figure to share and talk about their emotions. We talked about responsible decision making and how is it that we help children make sense of complex, challenging issues. And it was through this intervention that I think I wanted to share with you today because of the way in which it was really done, or at least intended to do. I hope we did it this way, really together, Padres Unidos parents together, such that, Missy was bringing her expertise as a community and schools person. I was talking as a social worker and as a professor, and parents were talking about parenting. And together we move forward to have really great conversations about how we can support children. And so as you're thinking about an intervention in some capacity, if you want to kind of go out and do this authentic engagement and encounter, to do some type of assessment about what a challenge or problem might be facing, and you're in that process of thinking, okay, now we get a chance to do something about it. We're going to try and make a difference on affordable housing, on education, on health disparities, whatever in our community. That in that process, thinking first about trying to, as these 3 bullet points here say, developing mutually defined goals, where the accompagnator plays a critical role in choosing how to move forward. Really, it was the parents in this group. I would set some general parameters around what our conversations would look like, but it was the parents who brought their expertise to the table and helped each other move forward in developing and improving the way in which they were interacting with their children. It was evidence-based insofar as that we brought together some experience from other places who have done parenting work. So the things that I was bringing were not just things I made up, but it came from a body of literature that has some evidence to suggest these are good things that we should be doing. And so you want to balance that evidence base, but also incorporating the lived experience of people living in the community and living with the problems that are happening at that school, in that neighborhood, so that you're incorporating those lived experiences and voices on a local level. And then lastly, emphasizing that together versus us and them. It's very easy in generosity work to start to think of yourself as the generous person giving and the other person is receiving. And that has to be challenged at every step in the way, particularly in this intervention stage. And if you're thinking about an intervention where something is going to be changing, where you're trying to bring about some positive social change in a community, in your world, that as you're doing that, to always find ways to make sure that everybody will have something to bring to that solution, and that everybody's opportunity to bring that solution is built into the structure of what that looks like. Alrighty, so that was an example of kind of what you can, an example of what an intervention might look like, or working in the community might look like. But it's also important to then think a little bit about evaluation as well. And so as you're doing this work, you've built relationships, you've assessed a problem or a challenge, you've intervened. Now thinking a little bit about evaluation, what do you want to be able to say that you've done as a result of your working together on a particular project? And what evidence suggests that you may have in fact achieved this? And so I have a picture here of an impact report that Shantiqua and I did actually a little while back for an organization called Child's Place. And we were focusing on the question of housing and education and employment for parents of young children who are experiencing homelessness. And as you may know about the experience of family homelessness in Charlotte, there were over 4,000 children who experienced homelessness at a given point in Charlotte during the year. That number may well have grown since COVID-19 has hit in. And children who are experiencing homelessness have all kinds of challenges, disruptions in their school, disruptions in their home environment, and their parents have all kinds of disruptions that lead all kinds of stressors that make things really difficult. And so the purpose of this organization was to help to support children who are experiencing that in the school setting, and to accompany families, mothers and children in most cases, on that path towards stable housing and on that path towards employment and increasing educational opportunities where possible. And what we were able to show is that over the course of a family's participation in the program, that we saw growth in employment and we saw growth in housing outcomes, that people were transitioning from insecure into secure housing. And so it's important to take these moments to look at this and to be able to say, hey, is what we set it up to achieve, was that achieved? And what did we learn with that? What are the things that we need to improve on and to build on? Because not all the things that we were doing necessarily yielded the effects that we wanted them to. And so it's always about revisiting what you've been doing, learning from what you've done, and saying, hey, is this having that effect that we as a community have set out and defined in our goals? And what do we need to do to help us to continue to grow in this way? All right. So as you're thinking about these 4 things, engagement, assessment, intervention, evaluation, I know there are lots of examples of church communities that have done this together on a collective scale. I kind of spoke on this a bit, thinking more about a collective group rather than just as an individual. So as you're thinking as a church community, how might you come together to go through this process, to address some of the challenges that perhaps your community, in conversation with Shantiqua and with Caroline and with others, are being faced in your community? What would that engagement process look like? What are the relationships that need to be built? Who are the people that you want to have coming together at the table to have that authentic relationship building and accompaniment that's so central to this work? And as you think about assessment, what are the expertise that you need to bring to the table, the data you need to bring to the table, but also the diverse voices that need to be brought to the table to really have a clear articulation of the problem you're interested in tackling, and ensuring that the definition of that problem reflects the very communities that might in turn be the target of that project or intervention. Then when you're actually going out and doing the work and you're actually making it happen, finding ways to continue to bring those elements of relationship and accompaniment to the work, making food happen, right? Developing relationships outside of the work, having all the people who are in the community who are addressing the problem bring their expertise to the table and help be problem solvers along with it as well. And then lastly, taking that time to think about the work, asking those questions and evaluating as you go. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over, I think, and see, I want to make sure I don't have any questions or anything in the chat that I missed. So I'll turn it over then to Shantiqua, if that's all right, to talk a little bit about some of the strategic plan work that she's been doing and how some of what we've talked about today might kind of incorporate or support this work as well.
Thank you so much, Drew. So, so good to see so many familiar faces this morning, so many friends on here. So I'll be really quick because I would love to turn it back over so you all can ask questions live. But if some of you may or may not know that the outreach area has just concluded a 6-month process of working with a consultant to really look at a long range plan for the outreach area. And based on the feedback that has come back, 97% of church members who were surveyed want to see a change. So that's a good thing. And they want to see a change that's going to drive a lot of what Drew just talked about, that deeper impact. And so the consultant came back to us and recommended a plan that was approved by session, that the plan would be faith-based, that's priority, place-based, midterm focus. Because of the context of COVID, we want to really look at not going 5 years down the road, but maybe 3 to 4, to really look at the context of COVID and what's happening there. And then multi-generational. First Pres has a long history of serving children, but we're also looking at how do we look at children in the context of their family, in the context of the community in which they live. This will have impacts on the global side as well. The overall recommendation from the consultant was for us to really narrow our focus so we can deepen those relationships and have more transformational interactions versus transactional interactions. So both from a local perspective and global perspective, we are wrestling to put the meat on the bones of this framework. But we're really excited because we understand at the end of this process, when we really get down to the work, we're going to increase membership engagement, church membership engagement. We're going to deepen the relationships that we have with our partners. That's the local agencies, but also the countries in which we partner with. And then it's going to really look at how we're structuring and how we're doing things internally that may stand in the way or may support the work that we want to do in the midterm and long term ultimately. So we're excited about that. You will be hearing more about that again as we flesh out some specifics and then come to the respective areas of the church to really sit down and talk about what that may mean. But it's all, again, in the spirit of wanting to deepen our relationships with those that we have been in long-time relationships with, quite frankly, but making sure that it is both a doing with and not doing for. So I will be quiet at this point and turn it back over to allow you all to engage with our speaker today. So thank you so much for joining.
And what I'll do is I'll just really quickly unshare the screen so I can see everybody, if that's all right. It might make it easier for us all to see each other. And then maybe we can open up for questions, and you can just unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable adding a question in the chat, that's fine as well, for Shantika or for myself or for each other.
So I have a question, and as I hear what you have to say and I look at your examples, they're all community focused, which is an important part of the work that the church does. But there's also a piece that lives under Shantika's area of global mission. So how, when you're not in proximity regularly with the people with whom you're serving, how does that change your 4-step process?
That's a great question. And I actually am currently thinking through that very question right now. I recently started working at a nonprofit called Child Spring International, which is housed actually at First Presbyterian Atlanta Church. So it was kind of cool to be working with First Pres Charlotte now too. And so at Child Spring, that the mission of Child Spring is to provide life-changing surgeries for children around the world. And we have done that for over 20 some years, and had children served from 52 different countries, though our priority areas are in a handful like Haiti, Colombia, El Salvador, and Honduras. And in this work, it is challenging to build those relationships when you're separated by oceans and barriers, especially during COVID when people can't travel. I think at the early part of building that global mission work, it involved a lot of the members of the First Presbyterian Atlanta Church to engage in mission trips. And so it was traveling to do with a lot of times medical professionals who could engage in doing work on site in places like Honduras and in Haiti and in others. And through those mission trips, relationships were built with people on the ground in those different areas, which eventually evolved into our work today. But there are some challenges with that approach. Mission-based work is really good for a lot of reasons, and it can fit in a context for a lot of reasons. But I think all of us can probably say with some certainty that if we were trying to receive ongoing health care for perhaps a chronic condition, that we wouldn't want to see a doctor who was going to fly away in a week. We would want to see a doctor who was there and present in our community. And so as these relationships were developed through Child Spring, as a program director now, I'm really trying to focus our efforts on supporting existing initiatives in communities and trying to strengthen health systems that do not have to rely on medical mission work, which has all kinds of challenges with follow-up care and things that we've already outlined. So I would say that mission trips are still going to be an important part because we have to build relationships, and those relationships a lot of times happen in person. But I've also seen other models of mission care, which can be really helpful. Sometimes it's doing, if you're a surgeon and you want to go and do surgical work in another community, sometimes bringing that expertise. But a lot of times you can think of a mission trip as a moment of encounter and learning and shared understanding, where we're not actually doing any work on this trip, but we're just going to work and to build relationships so that when you and I are sending an email 6 months from now or doing a text message over WhatsApp, it's not just only this transactional thing through technology, but rather rooted in a shared experience that we have and a shared understanding of what's happening on the ground in the communities where we're working. So I think that relationships are still critical in that work. We have to be creative about what that looks like. It's getting easier to do it now because of the different ways in which technology and access and the internet is now everywhere. But it gives us an opportunity then also to think about, okay, if our mission is to help create a world in which children all have access to surgery, that world cannot involve mission trips eventually. Eventually that world has to look like healthcare systems that we see in countries that don't have these challenges. And so we've now started to build lots of relationships, not just with individuals, but with entire hospitals, so that, when one person goes or one person comes, that the existing work remains the same and continues. We're really trying to fund also ways that are creative and interesting, but also that take into consideration the local economies there. You know, you can do in mission work, we can fund some surgeries, but if we fund a bunch of charitable surgeries here, we may have just destroyed a market for a developing surgeon who also wanted to create a business in doing surgical work. And now that they've destroyed that market, that surgeon leaves the country and there's brain drain and they go somewhere else. So we have to be mindful of also the effects that organizations have. Haiti is the place where there are more nonprofits per capita than any country in the world. That is a problem. and we have to recognize that we are, a part of that problem, but also continuing to think about ways in which we can build structures and systems that work towards solutions. So that's kind of a broad approach to the way I take it. And I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, Carol, but gets to the idea of how to do some of that global work a little bit.
Claire, it looks like you said John has a question.
Yes, he's going to be speaking invisibly.
We're at the beach and I don't
Bad hair, John.
I don't have a shirt on, so I'm going to save me and you the embarrassment. I'm interested in this approach because, as Shantiqua knows, we're in the process of crafting a plan for a related committee's activity, our advocacy committee. And as Drew talks about engagement, assessment, intervention, and evaluation, I presume, Drew, that you, in the assessment piece, as you assess the issue, you also are a bit in the goal setting side. It's kind of the premise as you evaluate, what are you evaluating? I presume the intervention is based on specific objectives, specific issues that one's intervention wants to be surrounding. So am I correct? Because it seems very easy at the point of assessment to say, oh, okay, here's what we ought to do. Here's the timeline hypothetically that we ought to target. You know, if it's building relationships, if it's looking for specific outcomes, so that by the point of evaluation, we know what we've been looking for and what we're hypothetically to assess relative to progress against desired outcomes.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question, actually, because it's a thing I love to talk about, as Shantiqua knows, with goal setting. Yeah, so in that assessment process, once you've come to an understanding of what that problem is, you would define it as a group and then set goals to achieve it. And I should probably revise the PowerPoint, add a few more lines that talks about that process. But I didn't want to get too in the weeds on it too. In the goal setting process, there's one thing that, you probably have heard of, like SMART goals or, other different ways or models of defining goals that are useful in situations like these. But the one thing that I would encourage you to think about as you're setting goals is to write them from the perspective of the person who is receiving, quote unquote, receiving the intervention. So instead of saying first pres is, I'm just gonna make this up, first pres is going to invest in 5 units of affordable housing. That could be a goal that you set, but what I think is better to say is to say, we're going to have members of our community access affordable housing through an affordable housing project that we put together. And so by shifting it by saying, putting the sort of action item, not from what you're doing, but from rather what the community is doing, it helps getting some clarity on what that actual transformational process is going to be. And you start thinking less about what you're doing and rather about the outcome or the results of your work. But yes, absolutely, goal setting is such an important piece of this. And that also ultimately provides the roadmap and sort of alignment that you need when you're engaging in that assessment, then intervention and evaluation.
Drew, it's Hal Clark. Kind of following up on that point, but shifting to your point about empathy. How does a white person like me authentically come across as empathetic to someone who's not like me? And thinking about that in the context of not only working with people of color, but also working with people who are suffering homelessness or an experience I've never had. How do you do that in an authentic way and not come across as patronizing?
That's a great question. And I think it's central, certainly in the work in Charlotte and really across America right now. It's hard work. And so what I would first say is that the degree to which you can prepare yourself to be comfortable in your own skin, to understand the challenges that are facing your community, to understand the benefits that are given to white people just because they're white. If we can understand that and do that homework beforehand, then also give yourself permission a little bit to try. And you may make mistakes a little bit along the way. But a good place to start is to show up, but also to not have to talk that much. Sometimes that can be a good way to start. That's what I try to bring when I go into a meeting for the first time and I'm meeting with people who are not from my neighborhood or don't look like me, is to go in and to listen to those conversations. And I think that the best thing that you can do also is just to continue to be there. So like, meeting people in churches, in homes, in community events, going to places that are not your space, but going to a place that's somebody else's space, only if invited, recognizing that, sometimes people need to have, want to just see their people. But, if that opportunity is available, to just continue to show up, to continue to listen, and to notice the ways in which all these things are happening around you. And I think that's not a perfect answer to that work, because I don't think I have necessarily a perfect one to it. But it's a starting point. And in the places where I think that there's that, in my experience where we've had success, I mean, when I was doing the group for Padres Unidos, I was the only Anglo person in the room. I was the Spanish speaker, which I think that also showed some credibility to the community because I was speaking a language that wasn't my own. And they watched. I mean, it's kind of funny because like I walk into a room and they're like, oh, here's a PhD. We're all gonna like respect the PhD person in the room. And I'm messing up my Spanish as I talk through these conversations. And I'm looking over at Missy and she's helping me with a word that I forget. And there was this beautiful moment of like, look, I'm just a person. Yes, I've gone to school for a long time, but I also have a 2-year-old at home and I'm exhausted because I was up last night. And you have that shared moments of humanity. And so as you're kind of having those situations, look for those moments of shared humanity in those conversations and embrace them and talk about them. Sometimes it's about talking about, your kids or talking about your experiences at church. But those can be places and allow yourself, to mess up in front of other people. Because I think that when we all come into those perspectives and those moments with moments of humility, that we see the humanity of one another and we can look beyond some of these challenges and race, class, gender, whatever that otherwise are barriers to relationship.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that? Yeah, I cannot agree more with Drew with what you're saying. And I grew up in Taiwan, and I have to say that many works actually from like foreigner missionaries and whatever, like the school they build, the orphanage they build, the hospital they build, actually is the best one, because I think sometimes outsiders have more empathy than when you are inside. So it just happened, sometimes, when you're inside, you don't see the problem, but, like if you're outsider, different, like nationality or different whatever, you sometimes look at the problem, you'll be like, oh, that's so obvious, but not with the people inside. So, you will have better idea, sometimes than the locals. And we just need to understand each other.
Shelley, I really like how you brought up this question of insidership and outsidership, right? And in many situations, you might find yourself on either side of that conversation. And recognizing that both of those things bring expertise and knowledge and importance to the conversation. Outsiders bring an objective view. Sometimes outsiders bring resources, expertise. They think, oh, well, we've tried this way and this other community maybe would work here. But then insiders also are the experts of the moment, right? They're experts of their lived experience of the challenge oftentimes that's being addressed in this conversation. And that also has to be brought into the conversation. And so when those two worlds can come together through dialogue and through shared understanding, you can really have a positive opportunity to move forward. Thank you, Shelley. That was a great comment. I appreciate it.
Are there other comments or questions? Rich and Barb.
This is Barb. I've been leading an effort for the church to develop a Girl Scout troop at a middle school, and we're in our 3rd year. We're a little bit behind the ball with the COVID, and that's causing some problems, but I think our longer term goal would be to include the parents of the girls, but we're having a hard time connecting with the parents because they've got lots of jobs to attend to and that sort of thing. Do you have any words of or thoughts around how to bring in the families with the girls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've done parent engagement work in schools for a long time. And sometimes it's hard to do that. I mean, I think it's funny because I used to start thinking about parent engagement, like how do we get, parents to come to the school and do events and things like that. And sometimes there's a deficit orientation in that conversation where it's like, oh, parents aren't coming to the school. They don't care about their children, which is not true. And I learned this, because I started having my child go to preschool. And we would have all kinds of events for parents at the preschool. And I would show up late, unprepared, or not at all. And I would pick up my child and go home every day. And I'm doing this parent engagement work. And I'm like, I care a lot about my child's education, but I look terrible as a parent, to the people who would be saying, how do we engage our parent at this community? And so I always remind myself of that parents have lived lives that are outside of the child's school. It doesn't mean they don't care. It just means that they, a lot of times, especially this is true of when I think of the Latino community in particular, there's a certain trust that hey, you've got school, I'll take care of home. School is kind of intimidating to me actually. So I'm just going to let you do it. But I'm just going to be here and we'll have you there. In some cases, that's not universal in the Latino community, but sometimes you can get that sense. And so I think that, as you're trying to do the work of engaging parents in this conversation, is always being mindful of making sure that what we're offering is what the parents need. And if one thing doesn't work, then it's okay to just reframe and try something else. And if that doesn't work, then try something else entirely. And that's all an okay thing in this process, because you're just trying to figure out what's going to make things work. There are some examples of parent engagement things that have worked really well. I was able to go out to Phoenix to visit. Arizona State has a really cool program on college readiness for Latino youth in high school. And they have this giant program, but when they go to these things, you have gymnasiums filled with parents and children and their children. And I'm like, how do you do this? How did this happen? But again, it comes back to the engagement piece. It was giving, in the words of Pope Francis, the thing that is so precious to all of us, which is our time. And I think that no matter what you do, if you continue to invest your time, and a lot of it, that eventually you'll get to that point where you'll feel like you've achieved what you were trying to do with the Girl Scout troop and engaging parents. But it's the hardest thing to give sometimes, because we all have lives and commitments and professional things and families. And so it's trying to figure out what that balance is in your life.
This has been wonderful, Drew.
Is there time for another question?
You're being here. Let's do one more question and then we'll get everybody ready to head to worship. And Drew's going to worship in Ohio. Is that where you're going to worship today?
Yeah, my nephew and godson is getting baptized in about 7 minutes. So I'll take one more question though. It starts in 7 minutes, but I don't have to be there right away.
May I?
Yeah, please.
So Drew, I think we need to call you back, but if you will put this on the back of your mind, our church has a child development center, which we've had for over 70 years. We have a wonderful project where we will be, where low-income families will have the opportunity to participate in our child development center. I'm using your language. I am very aware that even though everyone states an excitement, a willingness to participate and to change our community, I am also aware that as human beings, we often long for what we used to have. And so I don't expect you really to offer a solution. I would like to know how we can build into the process, either that we ignore the lament or we give opportunity to voice it.
So are you referring specifically to members of the community that are kind of looking back to what used to be rather than being able to look forward? Or I'm trying to make sure I understand the question.
So right now we have a child development center where 90% of the families pay the full fare for excellent, high quality childcare. We will be diversifying and expanding that program to give opportunity for low-income families who are eligible for federal child care subsidy to participate. That will cause some good changes, we believe, and but there will be change, which does not always come easily.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm super interested in it, and it would take an entire presentation to go.
I think it would. So we'll call you back.
But it's okay. What I will say is this, though, because I've talked about this theme a lot around accompaniment and time. When you're making a change like that, you have to bring everybody along, or at least try. At least create those spaces and opportunities. So we could just say, "Hey, we're going to do this," and then parents who have been going into this program for all the time are saying, "Hey, how did this happen, and why are we doing it?" But if you start with a conversation that says, "Okay, hey, we really want to talk about race in class with our child care program, and this is what we've observed, and what do you think?" And just like open up the dialogue and get things going. And it won't necessarily go the direction you want it to at first. And you need some skilled facilitators to manage that conversation. But I would say begin by having those conversations early on. But also, like in this conversation too, and I feel strongly about this, you're gonna probably, I don't know this, but if the experience in this community is similar to what I've seen in other places, you'll get some pushback. And so you're gonna need some strong leadership that's gonna keep you focused on saying, hey, we are going to make these changes. We are going to have this newly desired outcome. What I'm here to do is to help facilitate so we all understand why, and why it's so important, and why it's central to our mission as a church, based in a gospel message and rooted in a gospel message, that we do this.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I agree that we could have a whole nother session on a number of things. So Drew, thank you so much for being with us. I want to give a little preview of next week, but if you need to jump off and go log on to your next Zoom meeting, we understand, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll probably hop off, but it was wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity. Good luck in your next work, wherever this takes you. It's exciting. And so thank you so much.
Thanks.